Good to see everyone. I know that this is the final panel session of today's GradUCon and that you found today's conference, networking to be both helpful and productive. So I want to just share with you how this panel session will run. We're going to do some quick introductions in a moment, and then for the next 30 minutes, the panelists will respond to or reflect on a few key points. The first one being the transition from their graduate programs to the nonprofit sector, because all of you are drawn to this section hopefully because of your interest in exploring that. And I know that how it was messaged that there are 3 different tracks. The executive leadership one, so folks who run and oversee their offices or centers. The second track being development, those who fundraise and work closely with foundations and individual donors to make sure that the organizations are sustained. And then the third track is program management. What are those programs and services that help to meet the mission of a nonprofit organization and how to deliver quality programs to meet different constituencies. So that will take us to about 4:10, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So whatever doesn't get addressed in those 4 different areas, feel free to ask them. So they'll talk about the transition. Second, what experiences, skills have they found to be effective to lead them to where they are. And then the third key piece that they will also speak about is some challenges and benefits of being in the nonprofit sector. And the fourth one, leaving you with some practical tips and advice and some resources that you could look into. And I know that you've been given this sheet to take some notes, so feel free to jot down any thoughts that you have or questions. So we'll start with the introductions. Welcome everyone again. My name is Amy Chan. I direct the University Community Service Center here at UChicago, and I'm also an Associate Dean of Students in the university. As far as my background, I have been a part of national nonprofits in DC, Boston, and most recently with the Coro Center for Civic Leadership in San Francisco. And I've been in this role for a year and a half. And the graduate program that I did was at the Harvard School of Education. It was called Risk and Prevention under the Human Development and Psychology area. And my focus of the year was finding the correlation between academic achievement and character leadership development. So we will start at the end of the table. Elena, if you could give your brief intro.
Sure. I'm Elena Harkness. I am currently a program officer in the Community and Economic Development program at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, which is headquartered here in Chicago. It's an international foundation. My graduate degrees from the University of Chicago, I did a dual degree program. I did a master's in the Center for Latin American Studies, and during that degree program, I primarily focused on coursework in sociology and anthropology. And then I did a master's in public policy at Harris, the Harris School for Public Policy Studies. And so it was kind of a blend of qualitative and quantitative.
Thanks, Elena.
I'm Tamara Hamlisch, and I work at the university in the Department of Pediatrics doing program development, program evaluation, and grant writing for community programs for general pediatrics. My degree was in anthropology. I worked in China, so I'm a very long way from where I started.
My name is Monica Collins. I'm the Director of Development at the Illinois Humanities Council. We are a humanities organization. We're most well known for starting the Chicago Humanities Festival, but we currently have about 14 odd programs running throughout the state. I have a master's in medieval history from U of C, so it's a bit of an odd fit, but you'll see that a lot of us have not necessarily the most straightforward path. And what else? I think. Okay. All right. That's it.
Thanks, Martha.
My name's Adam Davis. I run a small organization that works nationally called the Center for Civic Reflection. We try to get people, organizations, and communities talking about why they do what they do. Not just how, but why. When I was here, I was in the Committee on Social Thought. I got my PhD around 10 years ago. Before that, I studied political philosophy at Boston College.
So thank you, panelists, for your intros as well as providing some context to some of the students here today. So we don't have to go in any particular order, but if you could just comment on how that transition was from the MA and PhD programs that you were a part of into the nonprofit sector. Like, what were those key decision kind of like points as well as factors to help inform that transition? And it might have been a smooth one or, you know, a circuitous one. So anyone could start us off for, you know, if you could comment, you know, in a couple minutes about that so we could move on to the next one.
I can start. So it was not a very straightforward path necessarily, but the thing I guess I'd want to say is that I wasn't necessarily focused on landing in the nonprofit sector. I had a topical interest in cities and urban development, which I was kind of considering tackling from a research perspective. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go on and get a PhD or to work in policy and sort of on the governance aspect of cities, or in where I ultimately am now, sort of in the nonprofit sector, supporting many of the groups, nonprofit organizations, advocacy and program groups that actually want to support various elements of improving city life. And that's where I ultimately landed. But I think the key factors in my transition, I'd done, as I said, this qualitative research project on community museums in Mexico. That's what I was working on for my Center for Latin American Studies degree. And then I jumped over to the Harris School and found I really enjoyed the applied work and the sort of feeling of being able to have a shorter turnaround time between the work that I was doing and the impact that I was having on the ground. And so that was ultimately what sort of led me away from a research and teaching career and made me want to focus on doing something in the city of Chicago, which is where I'm from originally. So I got interested in public housing. It was suggested to me that I should do an internship at the Chicago Community Trust, which is Chicago's community foundation. And that was what really launched me into the philanthropic sector, which I had not been considering really at all as a career track, because nobody really grows up and wants to go into foundation work, and it's a very small sort of niche field. But those were some of the key decision points for me.
Great. Thanks, Elena.
And we'll go in order. I'll go next. My path was incredibly circuitous. I've only been doing this for 5 years, and I got my degree almost 20 years ago. So I taught for 10 years. I was a tenured faculty member at a small liberal arts college, and for a lot of the same reasons that I just felt like, and especially working in China during that time where things were changing really quickly, and I felt like I was doing research that was moving really, really slowly. And so I started to explore different things. I ended up working in industry for a couple of years, and there were a lot of things that I really liked about working in industry. But I ended up back in, because the research piece of it, the piece that was still sort of missing, and so I ended up sort of backing into this position doing grant writing and doing a lot of working with faculty, physician faculty, to develop their community programs, to articulate them and then look for funding for those. And the job has just grown out of that. So it was really that sense of having that more immediate impact and being able to see results from what I was doing that I wasn't seeing through a teaching and research career.
So I'll actually mirror a lot of what everyone else has been saying. I think that it's a great misconception when you go into graduate school or you start your academic career that, you know, all of these people that you see out in the wider world have been terribly successful because they knew right from the get-go that this is exactly what they wanted to do. And I would say that the majority of people that I've actually met have had a circuitous path. I myself started off in biochemistry in undergraduate. Then, you know, midway through, I think sophomore year, I fell in love with medieval history. And then, you know, graduated, moved to San Francisco, started working for a nonprofit. Then, you know, went back to school to in hopes of pursuing an academic career. About halfway through my master's program, I had the sense that I wanted to work in something that had a larger public effect, and so I actually fell into work with the Illinois Humanities Council and in development, because that's actually where I saw the greatest impact, or the way in which I could have the greatest impact on the organizations and the communities at large. So I would say that for most of you who are worried that you have to start off and know exactly what you want to do, it's not necessarily going to be that way, and you would find that most people don't actually have that very linear path.
I would agree. I guess I want to agree and say the question was really about transition from grad school to the work world, and I think I'm trying to think back, and I don't think I was aware of a marked transition. In part because while I was in grad school, I knew I didn't want to be an academic, and so I was trying to do other things, so that the academic world didn't feel like the world I was fully subsumed in. So while I was working on my doctorate, I was doing all sorts of other things, but none of them were jobs with a capital J. They were joblets. They were little jobs that I cared about, but didn't know much about. And each one started to open up. So some of them were based on what I was doing here, like teaching, but instead of teaching traditional students, I was teaching non-traditional students, either because they were adults, or because they were low-income adults, or because they were kids over in North Lawndale. But I didn't have qualifications, except that I'd done some teaching and I'd done some work with young people, and then it was just keep trying things that seem worth trying. And then as those small little things continued to happen, some of them opened up more and more. And eventually, maybe to my chagrin, one of them turned into a job. And some of the joblets are still here, too.
So a few things that I hear the panelists comment on is just like they didn't see that path necessarily of being in their graduate programs and necessarily leading to their current roles, but I hear people talk about the applied piece of it and taking the theory and kind of seeing how it plays out in a real world context. Also, folks have commented on the impact piece of like, wow, like I have the opportunity to really see the results of communities changing as a result of my role. And then the other piece that Adam just mentioned is just really trying out things and being okay with not necessarily having that piece all figured out. So the second piece to this is like, what have you found to be those skills or those experiences that have made you effective in your current roles in the nonprofit space?
Should we reverse it?
Let's reverse it. Let's change it up. Mix it up.
Should we switch seats and then reverse?
Or Monica could go next. You could jump around, however, whatever works.
Sure, I'll go. I think that, and it's definitely true for me as a medievalist where, if you're not going in academia, you're like, well, what do I do now? I have no idea. There are not that many jobs out there for medievalists in the wider world. So, yeah. So I think that, it's a misconception that if you're going into business or you're going into the nonprofit sector, that the people who are, job searching, or not job searching, searching for people, searching for employees, are looking for someone with, a master's degree in business or, with all of this foundation support or, experience in the public sector. And what it really comes down to is that, the training you get at UChicago, both in terms of your research, whether it be medieval history or otherwise, and just in being in a community of thinkers really prepares you for, almost any field. I mean, yes, there's on-the-job training that you'll need to have, and yes, there's, a certain skill set that you may need to learn, but really it's that analytical mind that is really attractive to people who are looking for employees. And so I think that if you can emphasize, one, your personal strength, whether it be writing or research or, but also emphasize, a certain passion for whatever you happen to be going after. So my most effective skills that I gained at UChicago would be really the heavy research that I did here. I mean, just that sort of the honing in process, the diligence towards one subject was very helpful, but also Little Red Schoolhouse was great. They just, so that was very helpful for me.
So I can take, I agree, I think writing matters, being able to speak clearly matters, being able to listen well to people and feedback that stuff, which you do learn here, and which I don't think I was aware I was learning so much, really matters. I also think maybe the most important thing, especially in the early stages, is capacity to drive yourself, so self-discipline, which maybe is not the first term associated with grad students. I don't know. But I think if you're going to get through a grad program, you're going to do a lot of work on your own, and you're going to do it mainly because you care about getting it done well. And I think in a lot of the nonprofit world, that is what is going to distinguish you, is if you have a certain ethic about your work and the capacity to drive yourself. So.
Okay. There's a couple of things that I've thought about that have served me really well, specifically picked up at the Harris School, but I think applicable to work in the nonprofit sector more generally. So one of those things, there's a course at Harris called Policy Entrepreneurship, but what it's really about is the intersection of sort of the ideal policy or the ideal thing that you'd want to do in the world, and then the politically possible, and what you can actually get done, and trying to find sort of the sweet spot that's closest to what's the best that's possible given what we have. And I think that sort of pragmatic attitude, it sort of depends which kind of nonprofit you're in. If you're in a pure advocacy organization, maybe that's not what you want to be doing, but in an organization like mine, which is a foundation that's supporting community building work, community development work, sort of tactical urban improvement projects, that's a very helpful sort of space to be able to see and try to find your way into. So that's one thing that's sort of specific. I would definitely echo everything that has been said about the power of persuasive analytical writing and communications. That's something I do daily in my job and have to, certainly was honed here at the University of Chicago. Let's see, and then I guess, I don't know, on the analyzing and communicating piece of it, being able to distill quickly through a lot of research and through a lot of information, and to pull out sort of surfacing the key points and being able to communicate those effectively to an audience is something that I think is pretty widely applicable to a lot of jobs in the nonprofit sector, but I certainly rely on that skill almost daily.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add to those. I mean, I would agree with all of those things. They're all really important, and I know from hiring people, they're also really hard to find. So don't underestimate those skills when you're looking for a job, and find a way to convey them so that that the person knows that you can actually do those things. I would also say that my disciplinary skills or my disciplinary knowledge has served me very well. I did work in China, so that doesn't really count. But the ideas that the conceptual kinds of things. So culture, which of course everybody knows what culture is, except that in anthropology it has a very specific definition, which is extremely useful when I talk to people about how they're talking about a community. And this one example is a program that I actually helped to start that was initially in rural areas. It was about getting healthcare to rural areas. And I was part of a conversation about this program in New Mexico, and I came back to Chicago, and I went to the chair of our program, and I said, we should be doing this. And he said, well, it's really for rural. And I said, there's something called geographical space, and then there's something called social space. And he said, okay, tell me more. And I said, social space is the distance between 53rd and 59th is a 10-minute walk, and the difference between 59th and 63rd is decades. And that's social space. So to get from 63rd to 59th, which is where the hospital is, people can't get it. I mean, they can't get there, even though it's a 2-minute walk. And he has used that example over and over and over again. He thinks it was just brilliant. It was something I learned in my first year in graduate school. So the kinds of concepts that you're getting in whatever program you're in are going to be useful because people don't know those concepts, things that you take for granted and you think, oh, everybody knows this. They don't. So don't dismiss the disciplinary knowledge that you're getting, even if you're not going to become a X.
Can I add something? That made me think of something else. That's completely true. And I also think something that University of Chicago has made, is particularly good at is encouraging interdisciplinary thinking. And that is hugely important in the work that we're doing. We find a lot of value in people that are able to be translators between disciplines, and often those are the kinds of people that we're funding. We have to think that way to be able to see bridges. People that are in philanthropy, if you are a foundation program officer, you might as well call yourself a kind of super connector. That's your job, is to make sure that different communities that are maybe isolated or different policy fields are talking to each other. And those productive intersections are really, really important. And I think the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that University of Chicago permits and encourages really makes you, it's very valuable. It's hard to find people that can do that kind of crosswalking. I look for it when I'm hiring. Anyway, that's...
And I would echo what Elena's saying. I think it's becoming more and more important in University of Chicago with the Neubauer Institute and with the Art and Science partnerships that, that interdisciplinary action is very important, and not only in the academy, but in the work that we do as well. So we really look for collaborations with the business world, with the science world, with sort of the unusual suspects, and that's really something that you'd want to emphasize. I also wanted to point out that it spurred in my head when I said the Little Red Schoolhouse, but one of the most important lessons that I learned from that was know your audience, or write for your audience. So I would say that whether or not you're working on your resume and your cover letter, or, you're in interviews, or you finally get that job that you've always wanted, really pay attention to who you're writing for. And as a little anecdote, I was looking over a resume recently, and, it was a fine resume. It was from a master's student here at the university, but it was really written with that person in mind. So they were telling me about their research, how in depth it was, this and that. And to be honest, it wasn't that important because she wasn't keeping the audience in mind, which is the people who are hiring. So do they really want to know about, 12th century, intellectual renaissance or something like that? Probably not, but they want to know that you can write well and that you are, that those skills would be translatable. So.
Thank you for highlighting those key skills that you felt have served you well, but also we've all been in positions of our own job searches that have been quite extensive, but also noting what you, in your hiring role, in all our respective positions, are looking for. And how do you tell a story that's compelling and that really brings out some of the things that you are focused on in your current programs, and that makes you kind of stand out in different ways. So we're going to focus some attention on these 3 different tracks as far as the nonprofit sector, the executive leadership one, the development, and the program management. So if you could identify yourself of what track you're in currently, but also share with the folks what are the key benefits you have found in this particular track, and what are some of those challenges, just so they have an understanding if they were to pursue any of these tracks. And there is a lot of overlap too, that they have some context around that.
Okay, I'll start this time, I guess. Now I guess I'm formally in an executive leadership track, which I didn't realize until right now, so that's helpful as a frame. I used to run programs all the time, and that's still a lot of what I do. And then I've done some development, and that's part of being an executive role in nonprofit sector, is trying to keep your organization from disappearing, which means seeking funding. Some of the good things about this track, you get to make some decisions. You have some freedom to shape your workplace and the mission of your organization and who you work with and the vibe in the office. And also, for no good reason, people might think, oh, that's the director of that organization, which can feel good sometimes even if it's not deserved. So those are all good. It's also good not to be subject to rules that you don't think are worth being subject to. I actually think that's really important, is to think, in a workplace, what am I comfortable submitting to? And you submit to a little bit less when it's yours to shape. On the other hand, the challenges, you take it home at night. You're aware that other people's livelihoods depend on you, and if you do a lousy job, someone whose visa you worked out may have to end up going back to the country they're from, or a job may be lost, programs. So that's heavy. And I think if you're taking work in this sector seriously, you feel that. I don't think it's worth being in this sector unless you take it seriously. So that's one of the real challenges. And another challenge is, I got into this because I liked getting groups of people talking. I got into it for the programs themselves. Now I spend at least half of my time on the conditions that make the programs possible. And it's more work as I'm working on the conditions to think, why am I doing this? What is this for? The gratification is not as immediate.
I think I'm next. I'm obviously I'm the director of development at the council, and I've actually worked on both ends of the spectrum. So when I was working in San Francisco for a nonprofit, I was actually on the programming side, and then in this second iteration, I've gone over to development. There are many benefits to, I would echo what Elena said earlier. I don't think anyone from the get-go says, what I really want to do is development. That sounds like a lot of fun. But there are actually many benefits to development. So, first and foremost, I think if you plan on being the head of an organization, a nonprofit organization, or the executive director, you really have to have some development experience under your belt, because that's what they're going to be looking for. Because, unless you're a privately funded organization, what a good portion of your job as executive director is overseeing fundraising efforts. A second benefit to being in development is that you really get to see sort of the direct impact of your work, and so you're the one who's kind of on the front lines to make sure that these programs actually happen and the people that you want to see served actually get served. So that can be very gratifying. The third point about development is that job security. It's becoming an increasingly more advantageous field. There are always jobs in development, and oftentimes it's higher paying than if you're in the programming end.
So this is a really hard question for me, because I sort of bridge all of the tracks, and that's just a weird function of my very weird position, because there is a development office who I work with pretty closely, but I was actually hired into the medical center to do grant writing in collaboration with physicians. So there's somebody else who's doing a lot of the relationship management, and in principle is seeking out funding opportunities, and my job is to articulate those programs to funders. So at least that's how my job started out. And then the program that I just talked about, I helped bring this program to the University of Chicago, and now I'm the director of research and operations for that, so I'm doing a lot of the other things as well. But I can talk about the development piece of it in the sense that I would say that one of the good parts is that you get to see programs funded, and seeing programs funded, seeing people being able to do the work that they want to do, and being part of that just in the sense of, helping to get it articulated. And then you also follow the program through, because you're doing, I do all of the report writing. So I see both ends. I see when the money comes in, and then I see the results, the impact of the money. You also get to do the budgets, which I never thought I would like a lot, but it gives you an enormous amount of power. I mean, writing budgets is, you get to juggle where money goes, and it really forces, I mean, I have found, and I took a grant writing workshop when I first started with, which is going to go under the final tips, but, and they said, the first thing you should do is the budget, which of course, when you're coming out of graduate school, like, you write grants for your, I wrote tons of grants for my research when I was in graduate school and when I was a faculty member, and the budget was always sort of an afterthought. The budget really is because it forces the person who's doing the program to really think about what the components of the program is and what's going to make an impact. And I don't know how many times I've sat down with people and said, okay, so where would you use this money? And they say, I don't know. And by the end of it, I've got them spending $500,000. I've got a budget for $500,000 saying, well, you could do this and you could do that. And all of a sudden, opportunities start opening up because they think about what they could do with that money. So that, I think, is one of the really fun parts. I mean, the challenge is that, there's a limited amount of funding out there, and you're constantly looking for ways to find new funding sources. And relationship management is a huge part of it, and that can be challenging if you don't have control over your program. So you're managing a relationship on somebody else's behalf, and if that person isn't following through, you're kind of stuck in the middle trying to salvage a relationship or to repair a relationship when things are not going as well. So when it's going well, it's really fun, and you love them and they love you, and when it's not going so well, sometimes you're trying to figure out how you're going to tell them the right story to account for what you did with their money.
And actually, that's another piece that I had forgot to mention. A good portion of my job is actually grant writing, so that's actually, a really enjoyable part of my job because, it requires a lot of research into, the sort of the reasons behind, the necessity for a grant. For example, I just recently wrote a grant on did a bunch of research on intergenerational poverty, and it's fascinating work, and to actually sort of put that onto paper is the reason why this actually would have an effect on what you've researched is very fulfilling.
And a lot of times the people who are doing the programs haven't thought that through. I mean, they have a program, they know that they like this program, that this program can have an impact, but they don't really understand the background of why it can have an impact and how it can have an impact, which then leads to, evaluation questions as well of how they're actually going to demonstrate that they're using the money in ways that are productive and having the impact that the funder wants them to have.
So as a program officer, I'm here representing the program management track, I believe, but one thing I would say is that if you're interested in the nonprofit sector generally, don't get too wedded to any of these tracks, because it's quite likely if you're in a small to mid-sized nonprofit, you're going to be doing elements of all of them. And that's just a reality of sort of being in the sector, and that's what I see every day in the groups that I work with and fund. Many of us, and I have done this earlier in my career, you'll be doing some grant writing, you'll be doing some of the executive functions that involve, you could be supporting your executive director, you could be developing programs, but it's a little bit less tracked, I find, especially in small to mid-sized nonprofits. So that's just something to keep in mind. So multitasking and being open to those different kinds of functions is pretty important. So some challenges, I guess I should just quickly say, in my work as a foundation program officer, my day-to-day job is to decide the best ways to spend between $10 and $15 million a year to solve problems at cities. So that's my job, is sort of prospecting for the best ideas that are out there and trying to sort of craft program strategies that make sense, that have sort of a theory of change to solve a problem, to get to a specific end. So that's what I'm doing all the time, and it involves everything from prospecting and trying to sort of find who's the best in the field, what is the field we're even talking about. Then, of course, like reviewing grant applications, trying to understand what's the strength and quality of the program. Managing those programs, so to some degree that means I'm actually meeting with grantees very frequently. Sometimes it's much more hands-off. We're just funding a research project that all we want to know is what happened at the end. Tell us what you found. And then at the end, we want to evaluate and assess what was the impact of that investment that we made. And we have various ways of doing that, from commissioning research and evaluations to just sort of ourselves evaluating the products that that grantee delivers to us. So that's sort of the sweep of what I do. On a day-to-day, it's very much a lot of multitasking and different kinds of meetings. But so the benefit is that tons of new work all the time, and it's very creative and very generative, and I'm bouncing all around, even though community development seems like sort of a discrete field. I'm working on everything from violence reduction to how do you solve employment challenges in neighborhoods, what do we do about the foreclosure crisis. It's very diverse. It keeps me very interested and engaged all the time. The challenge is obviously trying to be an expert in all of those things is impossible, so you have to get quite comfortable with being a generalist and moving fluidly between people that have a lot more expertise than you do, and be able to sort of speak confidently as a critic of their project and trying to, tell them how to make the work better. So that can be very difficult. But again, the access to resources in a foundation, that's a huge benefit. I can have, it's not just the money, the resources, but the access to talking to the best people in the field, and having them take your phone call and pick up your emails. So I definitely treat that as a huge privilege, and it definitely keeps me getting up in the morning. But I think the challenge, again, is trying to sort of be conversant on a number of topics all at once. That's in my field, particularly in community development, can be a challenge.
Great. So it sounds like there's a lot of overlap, and again, if you are interested in one particular track, like there's no stopping you from exploring others, and there's a lot of, again, transferable skills that you could make use of. So before we turn it over to Q&A, I want the panelists to just briefly highlight maybe 2 tips or piece of advice for our graduate students, and maybe a couple of very practical resources that you found to be very helpful in exploring the nonprofit sector.
I mean, the most practical thing I'd say is just to repeat something I said earlier, which is try stuff now, don't wait. Being a grad student is actually a time when you have more control over your day than at almost any other point, except for the burden you feel to do your work. But your hours are actually not accounted for. So try stuff. It'll actually, for me, it's how I got through grad school. I wouldn't have finished grad school if I hadn't been doing lots of other things. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I was reluctant when I got into nonprofit stuff to put MA or PhD on anything. And I still think in many contexts it's not something you want to put there, but people I was working with started to say, this will help our fundraising, this will help with all these, and so just to recognize where is it useful and where does it get in the way, to have the academic backing that you have, particularly from a place like this.
I would say that the most practical advice I can offer you is, there's no straight track onto, which organization you're going to find interesting or which one you're going to, end up connecting with, because we all have different interests. And so I would say go to chicagononprofits.org, and they have a list of all the nonprofits in Chicago. And maybe this is too large, but pick 5 to 10 organizations that you really, really like. Research them really, really well, and go and ask the people there who, whatever track you happen to be particularly interested in, or someone who you feel would be, interested or amenable, and ask them for an informational interview. Go on their LinkedIn profile, check them out, make sure you research whomever you ask very, very, very well, and politely ask them for an informational interview. Now make sure if you go for that informational interview or ask for it, that you show up and you show up on time. And sorry, I know I keep telling stories, but as another little anecdote, I had 2 friends that I actually was in the master's program with, and they're both in research. Well, there was a couple years ago, someone asked them separately for an informational interview, didn't show up for either, like canceled one, then didn't show up again, and then canceled on another one, and then he did it to a third friend. Anyway, we all know each other, and so we all talked, and he didn't actually get offered a job at this other organization because he was so disrespectful. Anyway, so just make sure you respect people's time, because they are actually going out of their way to be very nice and to offer you advice and to help you find a job. And you'll find that the people that you ask, and I know it's unnerving and it's a bit nerve-wracking to go to these meetings with strangers, but you'll find that people really want to be helpful, and especially if they find that you've done your homework and really know about their history and their interests. And so they'll go out of their way to put you, they might not have a job at their organization, but they might know someone else who does, and they'll put you in contact with them generally. So, and also update your LinkedIn profile so that it's very current and sparkly. So.
And again, I would echo everything that they said. I think that for grant writing, volunteer at a local organization that interests you. You know, if there's a animal shelter or a domestic violence shelter or I don't know, a non-for-profit organization that does fundraising, go in and volunteer in some respect. And if grant writing is your thing, then offer to write grants. There are very few organizations that would turn down somebody to help them write grants. I mean, there's just not enough time in the day to have people pursuing all of the opportunities or to pursue those opportunities. There's two organizations. One of them is in Chicago, and that's called the Donors Forum, and they have an office downtown, and I can't tell you exactly where because I've never actually been in their office, but they have a library that's open to the public. So you could go to the library and look through their materials. There's a, pardon?
Donors Forum? Okay. Donors Forum, yeah.
And actually, yeah, the Donors Forum has a number of classes as well. So, you know, basic grant writing.
Well, I was just going to say that the foundation, there's another organization that's national that's based in New York called the Foundation Center, and they actually have classes as well. And their I mean, that was the class that I took on grant writing. And it was really a very good class. I mean, at that point, I'd already been doing grant writing for decades, but I found that for people, even for people who came from really small organizations that had no resources, it reached across the entire audience. And I just saw an announcement that I think they were doing free webinars, but I'm not positive. But they have a website. A lot of their website is open and available. And again, if you go and volunteer to do grant writing, that's a resource that you'll want to look for. There's, all kinds of resources to look for organizations that actually fund. So you can do searches based on, what the organization is, by geography, by the size of the organization, by all kinds of things. Those are places that you would go to sort of scout out what kinds of resources would be available if you were looking for funding, as well as if you were looking for an organization to work for or volunteer for. And I would just echo to just try things. I mean, I was a graduate student many, many, many years ago, and at that time there was nobody went outside. Nobody even talked about leaving academia. And when I was finishing my degree, I sort of, I didn't have the opportunity to think about it. I mean, I opened my mouth to sort of talk about alternatives, and it was like, why would you ever do that? And so I just went into an academic career and did it for 10 years before I thought, yeah, this is not really where I want to be. So I think that exploring things and thinking about alternatives while you're in graduate school is a really great suggestion. And there's opportunities even on campus. I mean, there's lots of organizations on campus that do all kinds of interesting things in the community or globally that would be a great place to start.
So I think that was an excellent point. There's probably going to be some time after. I think if you're finishing up your master's or you're, finishing up your PhD, there's going to be probably a few months in which you don't get a job and you're trying your best and nothing seems to be coming your way. Rather than have a gap in your resume, go find an organization that you find interesting and volunteer there, because that's another way that you can make really good connections and also have a little bit of experience that, a lot of people that I've talked to are always, a common thing that they say is that, how am I supposed to get a job in programming when I've never programmed before? Or how am I going to get a job in development when I've never worked in development before? That's how. You get an internship or you volunteer and you get that experience with an organization on that volunteer basis. And that really helps you to, one, learn the very fundamentals and also the lingo of the job, but two, it helps you build connections, and three, it really does look good on your resume if you're working with an organization that you're passionate about. Sorry.
And just two quick things I would add. The first would be to craft an excellent elevator pitch for yourself. Make it really passionate, because you're in this sector, well, you're interested, I'm assuming, here not because you want to be in the nonprofit sector, but because you have some sort of burning social change objective or objectives that you want to accomplish. So passion plays well in this sector, use that. I've had the worst informational interviews I've had are with people that just, it's very flat and they sort of like can't, like, tell me why you're excited and why do you want to talk to me and what are you interested in the world. So just concretely, I did a lot of journaling when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do after graduate. So back to this transition point, I was trying to sort of rewrite, how did I get here? How, if I'm looking back, does my history up till now kind of make sense? And what are some of the coherent threads that are connecting through? And I was able to see some pretty interesting things when I started doing that, but it was only through a lot of sort of thinking and writing for myself that I was able to really crystallize something that felt like a compelling kind of elevator statement. And it doesn't have to be that you know exactly what job you want, but for me it was being able to say in a really articulate way that what I want to do is, you know, change and address fundamental problems of inequality in cities and address the urban conditions. So I mean, and other things like that. But that was the core for me, and I was able to then talk about my past experiences in a way that sort of made it seem like I had been leading up to whatever informational interview I was having right then. So that's one thing. And then I think the second piece of concrete advice would be don't hem yourself into a sector. Really think about what it is you're trying to accomplish and think broadly and interview broadly and look for people that inspire you that are sitting, I mean, they may be in the private sector. There may be, I mean, for me, it's architects and designers, technologists, people that are not at all, you know, doing nonprofit or philanthropic work. So stay broad.
And I want to also mention a few other resources. So there are two really great job search engines, idealist.org as well as npo.net. There are also lots of opportunities on Chronicle of Higher Education. So just look for jobs, and they do speak to those who have an interest in the nonprofit sector. There's also an organization called YNPN, and it's a young professionals network of folks who are interested in that nonprofit field. And as Elena mentioned, it doesn't matter if you're necessarily in the nonprofit sector. There's a lot of businesses that do have a corporate social responsibility wing or department area. If social impact is your passion area, then you could do it in many different ways. I also want to highlight the University Community Service Center here on campus as a resource to volunteer, as many of the panelists suggested. So we're located on the ground floor of the 55th and Ellis parking garage across from Ratner. And we have a volunteer referral services program. So on the ucsc.uchicago.edu website, just click volunteer and fill out this really brief intake form. A member of that team will reach back out to you and set up a time to hear more about your skills and interests. And we will refer you to a number of organizations that are looking for volunteers, either on an ongoing basis or by quarter, whatever works for your schedule. And they do have the flexibility, and there's a high need for UChicago students who are able to bring that skill set to increase their organizational capacity. And then I also want to mention on Monday, we're going to hold an information session for anyone who qualifies for a federal work study. You have until February 28th to claim those funds, and there are so many nonprofit organizations and government agencies who are our federal work study partners who are looking, again, for UChicago students who have a desire to learn more about that nonprofit sector. And if it's more of a role where it's like, you know, I'm fine with doing more of an admin role to just get a break from being in Hyde Park, that's fine. But if you want to take on higher level projects, research, evaluation, they welcome it. So come to that session. I think there's a flyer in your packet. It's going to be 12:30 to 1:30, Classics 110, and you'll learn more about the processes of how to go about that, but also learn about some of the organizations who are looking for federal work study students. So we have time for a few questions, but a lot of the panelists address, hopefully, a lot of the things that were on your mind. And for those who need to leave, that's okay as well. So Jessica's going to grab the mic so we could take a couple questions.
While she's doing that, I just want to add one thing. There's a track that is not mentioned here, and that's the program evaluation track. And I have been involved in the evaluation field sort of peripherally, and I went to a big conference and came back and thought, oh, this is like research light. All of your research skills will be useful in program evaluation. I mean, if you like the research part of what you're doing, but you want to do something, program evaluation is a great place to get in, because it's a place that is really lacking in a lot of organizations, because a lot of people just don't have that research skill, that way of framing a problem and then figuring out how you're going to move toward evaluating it. So that's another track.
So before we open up the Q&A, if the panelists could respond briefly to it, just so we could get as many questions in the next 10 minutes.
Okay.
I was just wondering about the informational interview that you've been talking about, and in what context do you ask for it, and what objectives do you think people should go into the interview with, and sort of what purposes can it serve for people? I think it's maybe particular to certain kinds of fields that you would have that style of informational interview. So.
Well, I think, do you want to go? Or? I would think, or I would say that, oftentimes when you're asking for an informational interview, I mean, you have the idea that you want a job in mind, but, you don't want to go in and, interview with this person and then kind of hint at it. But, it comes out organically, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I think that what you want to do is go into an informational interview to really learn from the person that you're asking about their career path, their motivations, and then ask them for resources in the community. And if they have something that they feel you would be a fit for, they'll mention it. So I wouldn't worry about that. And also, as poor grad students, I understand that, you're worried about going on all of these informational interviews and having to pay for coffee or lunch or whatever. They'll always pick up the check, so don't worry about it. So, just go to informational interviews, be very polite, and then, just really try to learn from them and ask their advice. Like, have some very pointed questions about, what are some resources in the community that you can suggest for me to do this? I'm really interested in this career path. How did you find your way here? What are some of your motivations for pursuing this work? Some questions that just, really would sort of draw them out, and not necessarily, don't make it all about you. Make it more about them and how they can help you.
But make sure you leave them with that sense. I guess back to the point about not sort of under-impressing whoever your informational interview, this person is not, it's hard to find good talent. So this person is looking for good talent always, so you don't need to even tell them that tell them certainly where you are in your career path, but make sure they leave understanding what you're passionate about, what your career objectives are generally, what you're interested in, and what you would bring to the table, because I guarantee you, there's not a person who's ever impressed me whose resume I've lost. So, it's just treat it as if this person could be your potential employer. But, I think in terms of, you asked about context, and I think I will respond. I get informational interview requests all the time. I don't care if someone's career transition, just getting out of graduate school. I think there's no bad time to do an informational interview.
Yeah.
And always do follow up with either a thank you note
Yes.
or a thank you email. Just that little bit of courtesy goes a long way of standing out. Next question?
Hi, my question may be a little bit off track, but I think probably there's a lot of us in here in the same situation, is that master's degrees are expensive, and everybody that says if you're going to go in the private or nonprofit sector that you're not going to make much money, is that something that you guys have to deal with in your personal, do you have lots of loans, and how do you get around that, and do I really need to be worrying about it? I don't know.
I think that's entirely up to you. Yes, traditionally nonprofits don't pay as well as the for-profit sector. That's sort of the nature of the business, because you're sort of in it more for your passions than for, monetary gain. But I'd say that it's not that bad. You'll be able to pay off your loans eventually, and you won't starve. So I owe quite a lot of money actually still. So.
And I would just say that if you follow the development track, you can actually do really well. You won't do as well as if you're in the for-profit sector. It's just not going to happen. But compared to an academic job, it's pretty comparable.
Just real quick on this, I just think you want to weigh what's driving lots of your life choices. I don't think so I couldn't answer your question on its own. I think I'd have to ask, well, what matters most? What kind of, you want to drive a car, and what kind? Do you want to have that all figures in. And if daily satisfaction in your work matters more than knowing that you'll have a 401k, or not even that anymore because it's differently arranged, but so it is a commitment to usually lower paying work, at least for a while. So when I said jobless earlier, what that meant was no health insurance. I cared about the work. It was a risk. Then I had kids. Time to get a job. But I think now is a good time to take more risks. Don't quote me.
I agree, and also it's also the relative. So I remember the first job I had out of graduate school. It seemed like a lot of money. It was not a lot of money, but it was enough to pay my loans. And what I would say is the value of a master's degree in this field is tremendous. I mean, in nonprofit work, it has become sort of, to get on a professional track, a master's is almost like a bachelor's now. And so if you want to be sort of going places in management, and you will not waste the value of your degree. So that should not be a concern. And also just, no, coming out, you'll be going from a student salary, none, to having, it will feel like a lot of money if you're not, and I can't say enough, like the psychic benefits of having a job that you absolutely love to wake up to in the morning. I just came back from a college reunion, and you could tell the people who loved what they were doing and the people who did not, and it's really, there's no better thing.
After my graduate program, I did a fellowship, and it was paying $20,000 a year. And I'm like, all right, what does this mean?
Yeah.
But I made it very clear to my supervisor that I was willing to take that risk of just not being compensated in that way if there were more opportunities for growth. And then I moved quickly into a director role after having that entry point. So make sure that you're upfront and have those honest conversations, because that matters, because they will keep that in mind as they're thinking about growing their staff. And then everything leads up to it if, again, you are true to yourself and really listen to your gut. And so 5 P's that a colleague reminded focus around when he's like, yeah, I get a lot of questions about like advice, but I tell them like, think about purpose as one of the P's, like what are you driven by, like the mission of an organization? Are you driven by the people, which is the second P? Are you driven by the process of moving kind of like from one place to the other, or the product, where it's like, again, are you trying to sell a program, a service, whatever it may be? And think about pay as a big point of consideration, right? That's a reality. And the other P he kind of threw in is like place, geography, kind of determines whether or not you're able to have a decent kind of quality of life in a big city versus a smaller place where the rent is lower and other things. So there are many different things, and only we as individuals could answer those key questions, but continue to kind of like be reflecting and asking those questions that you pursue and kind of follow your path and kind of what speaks to you. A couple more questions? Yeah.
This question is about balancing work and life. Do you work a 40-hour week, or do you work long hours in this business?
Long hours.
Long hours.
I don't really work long hours.
I think it's about
Yeah, it does depend, because we do a lot of events that I attend, or staff, that can be long hours. But that's actually another nice piece of being in the nonprofit world, is that and I'm making a blanket statement here, so it's not an absolute, but it tends to be a lot easier on home family life. So there's usually flexible hours. They're usually better about accommodating for working mothers or fathers. And, it usually is 9 to 5. Not for some people.
I just want to say, I think actually organizational size and stage really affects
Yes,
that. So
yes.
I've always been
Yes.
involved with very small, growing organizations, and I felt responsible for their survival and growth, which means I can set which hours I'm working to some degree, so I can go get my kids when they get out of school some days. but then the minute they're asleep, I'm at the counter hammering away for another few hours. So it is long but flexible hours.
I would agree with that. Flexibility is really important, I think, for a lot of people, and it's not as common in the private sector. And the other thing is stability, which also factors into me to the sort of money thing. This is impressionistic and not based on statistics at all, but I just have the sense that people at a certain level in nonprofits, while if you're in a service organization that's affected by like state funding cuts, this might not be true. Most people I know that leave by choice and go do something else. There's not a whole lot of, cutting it. But I guess, again, that depends on where you are. I'm talking about like policy organizations and foundations and larger nonprofits, but I think it can be helpful.
Oh, I was wondering if you could speak to trends in nonprofits. I have been recently interviewing for positions, mostly in development, and I've noticed a lot of people moving in from the for-profit world, and I've interviewed with a lot of people who have MBAs, including at this university, and also who have undergraduate business degrees. And it's really rare, actually, that I end up interviewing with someone with a liberal arts degree. And I'm always glomming onto them and so excited to have conversations with them. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of the changes that you have seen through the years.
Do you want to? No?
Go ahead.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily static one way or the other. I mean, a number of people that I know who are in development actually do have liberal arts or social science backgrounds. If you are interested in development, there is an organization called the Development Leadership Consortium in Chicago. You can apply for a fellowship, and I actually did the program. And it's great because you meet with a number of different foundation heads for each of your meetings, and they sort of, give the pearls of wisdom. But the best thing about this program is you actually connect with a number of other people working in the sector from all different organizations. And so you get a really good mix of people and, make some really nice connections, friendships, et cetera, et cetera. So, but in terms of liberal arts or business, this is sort of, it's been my rallying point lately, but, I think that we have traditionally, or not traditionally, but have in the past gotten in a mindset where, business degrees are valued or, science degrees are valued. But I actually think that it's the liberal arts and the humanities, and, not exclusively, obviously, but, in the liberal arts and the humanities, I think that, and social sciences, I think that you end up with a bunch of really interesting, creative thinkers. And so I think, no matter what your background is, if you can really hone those skills of, not necessarily thinking with a one-track mind, but really thinking creatively about how you can benefit the organization, where your place is, and then I think that if you can make that known in your interview or, in your interactions with people, then I think that, that ends up being more important than whether or not you have a business degree or a liberal arts medieval history degree.
A couple quick sector trends, if I can.
Yeah, go.
One, value of technological knowledge, like the ability to do anything on the internet with digital skills, whether it's making a web page or just understanding web analytics, that's really high value in the nonprofit sector for sure. So to the extent those are the kinds of things that we might have used to go out and just do a fundraising or grant writing class, but really anything you can bring to the table on the tech side is really important. Likewise, the value of sort of understanding data and the amount of information that's kind of coming at us all the time. Analytics skills are really important. And then the third thing I would say, which I think is really just an acceleration of a trend that's been happening for years, is again this blending of the sectors, blended value, people like corporations looking for a triple bottom line, and then a lot of approaches. There's something called impact investing, where more foundations are thinking about how to use their money for ways that they'll get actually paid back. So instead of making grants, they're making loans. So there's a lot of these hybrid, how do we think about other ways to fund social work and the social impact, and those are sort of trends. So I think that's maybe part of why you see more people with business degrees thinking about, how they can use their business degrees for more explicitly social purposes, but they may also be interested in making profit too. So I think that's it's a blending of the sectors, that there's a lot of interesting resources about that if you're interested.
Yeah, so I know that maybe some of you have more questions, so if the panelists are okay with connecting with folks individually, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists.